Here's a skull study in raw umber and white. I'm going to start with the palette and build this up along with you from start to finish. Just like with the eggs, for this exercise we're just going to use raw umber and titanium white, and I even have a couple of values left over from the eggs. So I'm going to do the same thing as last time and start dark to light, so raw umber with a little bit of white, and basically make some tints and maybe make 5 values, and I'll have my raw umber for the darkest dark and titanium white for the lightest light. Again, my palette is painted to match the color of my painting surface. Makes it much easier if the paint looks the same on the palette as it's going to look on the painting. So I'll mix up some color. So here I'm mixing my way from dark to light until I end up with a set of regularly gradated grays from raw umber to white. And having these available to you, I think, is really important, especially as things get more complicated, because if your painting is going well and then you have to go back and mix a value that's a little bit lighter than what you were just painting, then you change gears. So if you have it all available to you the whole time, it's much easier for you to stay in the moment. So it may seem like an extra step, but it's really going to make things easier. Here's a skull. It's a lot more complicated than an egg shape, but you can see it's basically a lot of eggs. The overall shape is sort of egg-like, and then there's a lot of smaller forms you can turn just like you would an egg. So just like I'm going to do in general, I'm going to start with form. I'm going to map everything out with only raw umber because I want a good map before I start putting a lot of paint on there. And one of the things I want to sort out is the drawing, like where things are, proportion, how I want to compose things, and where my skull goes from being day to night, right along here like a planet. So now I'm using a round brush and only raw umber to map out the skull. I have a little piece of paper towel in my hand that I'm using some of the Gamsol to correct with where I see my drawing mistakes. I'm checking angles and measuring as I go to make sure I get a good structure in. And I'm only using the raw umber because that way it's easy to correct. At this point, if I get something wrong, I just wipe it off and fix it. So it's a really logical way to start. At this point, I'm painting on paper, and one of the advantages to painting on paper is that I can compose a little bit after the fact. What I mean by that is, if it's on paper and I want to, say, tighten it up and just have the skull on, I can just put more tape on and kind of see how I like the edges. Like, I like it a little, he doesn't need so much air above him. I can tighten it up some, make sure it's straight. It's easier to do it on paper than it is on, say, especially stretched canvas, because if you do it on stretched canvas and you have a painted square inside a blank canvas, the blank canvas really doesn't look quite as resolved as it does on paper. Plus, I could always just cut down these borders if I wanted, since it's on paper, and have a much easier time recomposing. So I'm just going to tighten it up. I like it a little bit more in front of the face than behind the head. There. That's not quite straight. Straighten it out. So now I have the foundation for this, and I'm going to start by looking for my darkest dark, set in the cast shadow, set in the shadow part of the skull. The skull is actually a lot lighter than what's behind him on the face, but darker than what's behind him back here. So I'm going to be careful to keep that relationship, because it's one of the things that makes him look like it's in space, where he's darker than what's behind him and lighter than what's behind him. Here's the skull from the angle I'm seeing it. I can't have the camera exactly behind me because then it blocks your view for the demonstration. So here's what I'm looking at when I'm talking and painting. So now I'm starting with the very darkest darks, which is right where the skull rests on the felt, and then working my way up to the second and third darkest darks on the skull. And you can see I'm putting it in sort of wherever I see it, which will speed things up. If you have your values, you may as well put them in wherever you see them. If you see it in 5 places on the skull, go ahead and get it going everywhere you see it. Now I have a map. I have the shadows laid in. the next thing I'm going to do is do the surround. Again, the word background is usually used, but I like the word surround more because it implies a more active relationship. Because when I make this a little bit darker, it'll already lighten up the lit part of the skull. Again, this is a mid-tone gray, not white, so I still have a lot of room to go with brightness. I haven't touched any of these. I'm really working my way, again, dark to light and back to front. So the next thing I want to do is put everything surrounding the skull in. Since we're covering a big area, let's use as large a brush as we can control. And you can see I'm nudging my drawing a little bit here and there as I lay in the surround, and being careful to notice where the skull is lighter than what's behind it and where it's darker than what's behind it. And that's very important. Notice where something's lighter and darker than what's around it, because that helps it sit in space. Now I have everything addressed, and I've been working my way consistently dark to light, back to front. And one reason to do this, it seems very systematic, but the reason for that is it makes it easier to correct as you go. If I want to fix this, I could get my little piece of paper towel with a little solvent on it and erase it out. If I have the whole thing wet right away, it's going to be much harder to fix the drawing, and the drawing's more complicated now. So that's the reason I'm being so systematic about the way that I build it up, is to try and build some fallibility into the way that I'm working. So it's really important, because I'm gonna make mistakes. I'm gonna need to fix them. So if I do it this way, it's much easier to fix them than if I have a lot of paint everywhere and I have to scrape it off and I get more frustrated. So that's the reason for this way of building things up. So map it out, set in the darks, cast shadows, the shadows on the object you're painting, whatever it is, and then the surround, and now I'm going to work my way up to the lights. Here's a closer look at the painting and the skull as we're working on it. So as I start to work my way up to the lights, one of the things that makes people fret a lot are the teeth, because there's a lot of detail there. Squint and think of the teeth sort of like a cylinder. You know, if you bite a piece of bread, it has a curve to it. So if you just think of the teeth facing a different direction, because people tend to look at the teeth and just make them one at a time, and then they sort of straighten out, and it doesn't look like it's on a curve at all. So now here is the painting at that point as I'm working my way up to the highlight, and you can see the teeth are basically just sort of dark to light, with just a few details picked out, which I actually honestly need to fix probably, but I'm starting to get my soft and hard edges resolved and working my way slowly up to the highlight. At this point I want to, as I'm starting to work up to the highlights, you'll notice I have only touched these colors that are mixed with raw umber. I haven't even touched this has a little bit of umber in it, and then this is pure titanium white. You know, when something is colored white like the skull, you tend to think of it as white and start putting white paint on, but we'll never get highlights if we do that, right? So I need to save out my lightest light, which means everything else gets scaled a little bit darker. There used to be this stuff that they would look through called clawed glass, and it would sort of pull all the values down. Another thing that you have with you is a phone is a little bit like what used to be called a black mirror. So you can look at your object like this, it'll reverse it. You can look at both your painting and your object like this, if you put your phone right up next to you, and the dark mirror of your phone will pull the values down a little more like what you can get with paint, and reversing it also makes it easier to see where your drawing is off. So that's a good little tip, and something you probably already have with you that you can use to check your drawing. So I've got my phone here, and just to show you what I was talking about a little more particular, see if you hold it up to your eye, you can see the skull backwards and my painting backwards at the same time. So it's useful, and you notice it's also a little bit darker. It makes it a little easier to see the highlights in the reflection than it is on the skull itself. So this can help you with your drawing and sort out your values. And you usually probably have it on you. So now I'm finally working my way up to the highlights and also maybe adjusting some of the shadows wherever I see the drawings wrong, just sort of freely adjusting everything. Again, that's why it's handy to have all these values mixed up so that if I want to fix my drawing, I don't have to stop what I'm doing and mix. So this is a really logical way to build up not just this sort of thing where you're working in one color, but when you have more colors as well, it makes more sense to break it down into a logical order to help you make the complicated problem of painting things in the world with colored grease more simple and clear. So we map out with a dark color with no white in it, lay in the shadows, lay in the surround, and work your way up to the highlight. And here is the painting again with a closer view of the skull at the same angle. One last thing to mention, since I did tape off the edges, it actually, when you peel off the tape, it kind of makes it tighten up a hair, look a little more finished. So again, that's another one of the advantages of working on paper besides portability. You kind of compose after the fact. Also good if you're taping something off to peel the tape off right when it's dry. So here's the finished skull. I hope this has been useful and enjoyable for you, and these principles are helpful for you in painting a lot of things.